Michael Johnson was a man shaped by the soil. For more than 60 years, his life began before sunrise, walking across damp fields, guiding tractors, and checking the crops that grew under his care. His farm was not big or fancy, but it was his pride and his lifeline. Every wooden fence, every rusty tool, and every patch of green land carried his family's history. His father had worked this land, and so had his grandfather before him. But now, times were changing. The farm needed repairs, the machines were old, and the harvest had been smaller this year. Bills piled up on the wooden table in his small farmhouse, and Michael knew he could not keep going without renewing his farm loan. He trusted the bank, the same bank where he had gone for 30 years. He had always paid back his loans, never missed a due date, and never asked for favors. That morning, he put on his best shirt, his old brown jacket, and polished his shoes as best as he could. Holding his weathered hat in his hand, he took the early bus to town. The bus dropped him at the corner, and he slowly walked toward the tall building with shining glass doors. The bank stood proud, modern, and cold in its design. People in suits moved in and out, talking on phones, carrying briefcases, barely noticing anyone around them. Michael walked in quietly, feeling a little out of place. The air smelled of polished wood and fresh coffee. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up from her computer. Behind her glass office sat Susan Miller, the bank manager. Susan was known for her confidence. She wore a sharp navy blue suit, her hair neatly tied back, and her eyes quick to judge. She liked dealing with big clients, the kind who spoke of investments, large accounts, and future projects. When she saw Michael walking in with his simple clothes and old hat, she immediately decided he was not the type of client who mattered much to her. Michael cleared his throat politely. "Good morning, ma'am. I came to see about renewing my farm loan. I've been a customer here for a long time." Susan glanced at him briefly. "Do you have an appointment?" Her tone was cool, her eyes already shifting back to the papers on her desk. "No, ma'am," Michael answered honestly. "I thought I could just come by. I've always met with the bank when I needed help. I just need a few minutes." Susan gave a small sigh, the kind that showed impatience. "You'll have to wait. I'm busy with important matters today." Michael nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't remind her of his long history with the bank. He simply walked to the seating area and lowered himself onto a chair in the corner. He placed his hat carefully on his lap and folded his rough hands over it. Minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. He watched people come in, men in fine suits, women in smart dresses. They were greeted warmly, guided quickly to offices, and served with smiles. Michael waited. An hour went by. His back grew stiff, and he shifted uncomfortably in the chair. Still, he said nothing. He simply watched the people move around, his eyes calm but tired. Susan looked at him now and then through her glass office. To her, he was just an old farmer. His clothes were plain, his shoes worn. She told herself that she had more valuable clients to attend to. Another hour slipped by. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he held his hat. His throat was dry, but he didn't want to bother anyone for water. He remembered his wife, Linda, telling him years ago that patience was a man's true strength. And so, he waited. Yet, something inside him felt heavy. He thought of his farm. He thought of his crops that needed care. He thought of the bills lying on the table back home. He had come all the way here, hoping for help, and now he was treated like he didn't matter. But still, his dignity held him in silence. The lobby grew busier. Phones rang, footsteps echoed, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. But Michael remained in the same seat, waiting with the same quiet strength he had carried through years of farming. What Michael didn't know was that this was not going to be an ordinary day at the bank. The board members of the bank were scheduled to arrive for a surprise inspection. They were important figures, people who decided how the bank was run and how it treated its clients. Susan didn't expect them so soon. She was busy focusing on her large accounts, on numbers and reports, never once considering the old farmer sitting patiently in her lobby. But when the heavy glass doors opened, and the board members began to walk in, her confident smile froze. Her face began to change, and in that very moment, the story of Michael Johnson, the elderly farmer, was about to take a turn that no one in that bank could have predicted. The sound of polished shoes echoed through the lobby as the large glass doors opened. A group of men and women entered, their presence commanding attention instantly. They were the board members of the bank, dressed in fine suits, carrying leather files, their faces calm but serious. Susan Miller, the bank manager, stood up quickly from her office chair. The confident smile she had worn all morning appeared again, but this time it looked different, forced, nervous, almost shaky. She rushed to the entrance, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Welcome, Mr. David Williams," Susan said with enthusiasm, shaking hands with the chairman of the board. David was a tall man with graying hair, known for his fairness and sharp mind. He nodded politely. Behind him came Linda Brown, another board member, respected for her strong views on customer service. With them were two more senior members, all important figures who shaped the bank's reputation. The staff in the lobby straightened their ties and adjusted their files. Everyone wanted to look perfect in front of the board members. But as the group entered, David's eyes wandered across the lobby. That was when he noticed Michael, the elderly farmer, still sitting quietly in the corner, his hat resting in his lap. David slowed his steps. His eyes softened. He was from a small town himself, and he understood the look of a farmer. Years ago, his own father had been in that same position, waiting, ignored, yet holding dignity in silence. "Good morning," David said, walking toward Michael. His voice carried kindness. "How long have you been waiting, sir?" Michael stood slowly, surprised by the attention. "Good morning, sir. I've been here for a while. I came to talk about renewing my farm loan, but I didn't want to disturb anyone." Susan's face turned pale. She hadn't expected the chairman to speak directly to Michael. She quickly stepped forward, her voice too sweet now. "Oh, Mr. Johnson. I was just about to call you in. We've been a little busy today." Michael looked at her quietly. He didn't say anything, but the truth was written on his tired face. He had been waiting more than 2 hours, and no one had cared. David turned his gaze toward Susan. His expression grew serious. "2 hours?" he asked firmly. "You left this gentleman waiting here for 2 hours?" Susan stammered. "Well, I had important clients this morning. Big accounts." "I didn't mean," Linda Brown, the board member, interrupted her. "Every client is important, Miss Miller. This bank has survived for decades because of people like Mr. Johnson. Farmers, workers, families, they are the foundation of our service. If we treat them poorly, we lose not just respect but our purpose." The staff in the lobby grew silent. The weight of Linda's words filled the air. Susan's confident posture crumbled. She lowered her eyes, realizing that her actions were being judged by the very people who decided her future at the bank. David placed a hand gently on Michael's shoulder. "Mr. Johnson, please come with us. Let's talk inside." Michael's eyes widened. He had never imagined that the board members themselves would sit with him. Slowly, he followed them to a large meeting room. His steps were steady, though his heart beat faster. For the first time that day, he felt respected. Inside the room, the board members invited him to sit at the long polished table. Susan stood by the door, her face tense. David leaned forward. "Mr. Johnson, please tell us about your farm. What do you need?" Michael hesitated. His voice was soft, but it carried honesty. "I've worked my farm all my life. My machines are old, and the harvest wasn't good this year. I just need my loan renewed so I can repair the equipment and keep the farm running. I've never missed a payment. All I want is a chance to keep working." There was silence in the room for a moment. Then Linda spoke gently. "Your words remind me of my father. He also worked the land. People like you feed our nation, Mr. Johnson. We will make sure you get the support you need." Michael lowered his head in gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. I don't ask for much, just fairness." Susan's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but the board members' expressions told her to stay silent. David looked at the documents Susan had left on the table. He found Michael's file, his clean record, his history of timely payments, his decades of loyalty to the bank. He closed the file and spoke firmly. "This loan will be renewed immediately. In fact, we should offer him better terms. Loyalty deserves reward, not punishment." Michael blinked, hardly believing his ears. Relief washed over him, and for the first time in a long while, his heart felt light. The board members smiled warmly at him. Susan, however, stood frozen. Her earlier arrogance had vanished. The same old farmer she had ignored for hours had now become the center of attention, his dignity shining brighter than any suit in the room. And as Michael walked out of the meeting with the board members by his side, the entire staff of the bank looked at him differently. They no longer saw just an old farmer, they saw a man of patience, strength, and quiet honor. When Michael stepped out of the meeting room, he carried himself a little differently. His back was still bent with age, his hands still rough with years of labor, but there was a new light in his eyes. For once, he felt that his voice had been heard. The board members had treated him with respect, not as a burden but as someone who mattered. Susan Miller, on the other hand, remained in the office, her confidence shaken. She kept replaying the moment when David Williams, the chairman, had questioned her. She had always thought success meant chasing after big accounts and wealthy clients. But in those few minutes, she saw how quickly her pride could turn into shame. The old farmer she had ignored had become the focus of the most powerful people in the bank. As Michael walked through the lobby, the staff who had barely noticed him earlier now looked at him differently. Some even offered polite smiles, while one young employee stood to open the door for him. Michael nodded in thanks, though he did not seek attention. He only wanted to go home, back to his farm, and tell his wife that their future was safe for another year. Outside, the sun was bright. Michael paused on the steps, holding his hat tightly. The city traffic moved around him, but for a moment he stood still, thinking about the morning. He remembered how invisible he had felt while waiting. 2 hours of silence, ignored as if he didn't exist. Yet patience had carried him through, just like it always had in the fields when storms delayed planting or drought slowed the harvest. He boarded the bus home. As the bus rolled past shops and houses, his mind wandered to the farm. He thought of the barn roof that leaked when it rained, the tractor that coughed and sputtered before starting, and the soil that was waiting for seeds. With the loan renewed, he could finally repair what was broken. He could breathe again. Back at the bank, the atmosphere in Susan's office was tense. David and Linda stayed behind after Michael left. "Miss Miller," David said firmly, "this morning was a lesson. Never forget that every client, no matter how small their account seems, is valuable. Farmers like Mr. Johnson are the backbone of our country. If we fail them, we fail ourselves." Susan lowered her head. "You're right, sir. I made a mistake." Linda's voice was softer but equally sharp. "Respect is free, Susan. It costs nothing to treat someone with kindness. Remember that." When the board members finally left, Susan sat in her chair, staring at her reflection in the glass wall. For the first time in years, she felt uncertain about her role. She had chased numbers, reports, and profits, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten the human side of banking. Meanwhile, Michael reached his farm as the sun dipped lower in the sky. His wife, Linda Johnson, was waiting on the porch. She had silver hair and kind eyes, the kind that had stood by him through every hardship. "You're home late," she said gently. Michael smiled faintly. "The bank made me wait." 2 hours. Linda frowned. 2 hours? Why would they do that to you? Michael took her hand, his voice calm. "It doesn't matter now. The board members themselves came. They listened to me. They renewed the loan. We'll be fine." Tears welled in Linda's eyes. She squeezed his hand tightly. "I told you, Michael. Your patience is your strength. God always watches." That night, as Michael sat at the dinner table with his wife, he felt peace settle over him. They ate simple food, bread, stew, and fresh milk, but it tasted richer than any grand feast. Because with each bite, they knew their farm had a future again. The next few weeks brought changes. Michael repaired his tractor, replaced the broken barn door, and bought seeds for planting. Every morning, he worked in the fields with renewed energy, even though his body was slower than it used to be. He often thought of that day in the bank. He didn't feel anger toward Susan, only a quiet understanding. People sometimes forgot the value of humility, but life had a way of reminding them. Back at the bank, Susan's mind was restless. She kept thinking of Michael's face, the way he had waited so patiently without complaint. She thought about his quiet dignity compared to her own hurried, dismissive behavior. For the first time, she wondered if her definition of important needed to change. A week later, Susan found herself driving past the countryside. She saw stretches of farmland, green fields under the wide sky, and old barns standing proudly against the wind. Somewhere out there was Michael's farm, she realized. Somewhere, that farmer she had ignored was working harder in one day than she worked in a week behind her desk. The thought stayed with her. Life was teaching Susan a lesson she had never expected. Success was not about how fast you climbed, but about how respectfully you treated the people you met along the way. And though Michael did not know it, his simple patience was beginning to change the heart of a bank manager who had once overlooked him. The city had returned to its normal rhythm, but Susan Miller's heart had not. Days passed since the board's visit, yet the memory of Michael Johnson sitting quietly in the corner of the lobby refused to leave her mind. Every morning, when she walked through the glass doors of the bank, she almost expected to see him again, hat in hand, waiting with patience. At first, Susan tried to bury herself in work. She polished reports, answered calls, and dealt with high-profile clients. But her confidence no longer felt solid. Whenever she looked at a customer, she wondered if she was truly seeing them or only their account numbers. The board members' words echoed in her mind, "Respect is free. Every client matters." One Friday afternoon, as she reviewed files, Susan found herself staring at Michael's name. His loan had already been renewed under the board's instruction. His file showed a clean history, no delays, no unpaid bills. He was not just a client, he was a man who had carried his farm for decades with honesty and hard work. She closed the file slowly, leaning back in her chair. Something stirred inside her. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe guilt. She realized she knew nothing about the man she had made wait for 2 hours. To her, he had been just an old farmer in worn clothes. But who was he beyond that? What kind of life did he live? What kind of strength did it take to survive in silence like he had? The thought stayed with her over the weekend. On Saturday morning, instead of sleeping in as she usually did, Susan got into her car and drove out of the city. The tall buildings gave way to open land, the roads grew quieter, and the air fresher. Soon she saw wide fields stretching under a blue sky. Green rows of crops bent gently in the breeze, and barns stood tall against the horizon. She slowed the car as she passed wooden fences and dusty paths. When she finally reached a small farmhouse with a red barn beside it, she stopped. The sign by the gate read Johnson Farm. Susan hesitated. She was not sure if she should knock. She worried that Michael might not want to see her, remembering how she had treated him. But then she saw him in the distance, working near the barn. His back was bent as he fixed a piece of equipment. Beside him stood his wife, Linda, handing him tools with gentle care. Susan stepped out of the car. The sound of the door closing made Michael look up. For a moment, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to recognize her. When he did, he simply stood still, wiping his hands on his old cloth. "Miss Miller," he said slowly, not with anger but with surprise. "What brings you here?" Susan took a deep breath. "Mr. Johnson, I came to apologize. That day at the bank, I treated you unfairly. I made you wait. I didn't respect you, and I've regretted it ever since." Michael studied her face. His wife, Linda, came closer, her eyes curious but kind. Susan continued, her voice softer now. "The board members reminded me of something I had forgotten, that every client matters, no matter who they are. You showed more patience that day than I've shown in years. And I want to understand. I want to see your life, your work, if you'll allow me." Silence lingered for a moment. Then Michael's wife smiled gently. "Would you like some tea, Miss Miller? You've come all this way." Susan nodded, relieved. "Yes, thank you." They invited her into the farmhouse. The living room was simple but warm, with wooden furniture polished by years of use. Family photographs hung on the walls, smiling faces, children, harvest days. Susan noticed the quiet pride in every detail. Over tea, Michael spoke about his farm. His voice was steady, carrying both hardship and hope. He talked about the early mornings, the seasons of waiting, the repairs that never seemed to end, and the joy of seeing crops grow after months of hard work. Susan listened closely. For the first time, she saw the depth behind the man she had once overlooked. His life was not just about money or loans, it was about legacy, patience, and survival. I thought you were just waiting in the bank that day, Susan admitted softly. But now I see you've been waiting all your life. Waiting on the weather, on the land, on the seasons. And yet, you keep going. Michael smiled faintly. That's farming, ma'am. You learn to wait. You learn to work while you wait. Complaining doesn't grow crops. His words settled deep in Susan's heart. She realized that Michael had given her something the board couldn't, a lesson about endurance, humility, and quiet strength. As the afternoon sun lowered, Susan thanked them both. I can't undo that day, she said honestly. But I can change how I see people. You've taught me more than any report ever could. Michael tipped his hat politely. We all learn, Miss Miller. The important thing is not to forget. Driving back to the city, Susan felt lighter. She had walked onto that farm carrying guilt, but she left with something else, a new perspective. She promised herself that no client would ever sit invisible in her bank again. She didn't know it yet, but her visit to the Johnson farm would become the beginning of a transformation, not only in her career but in her heart. When Monday morning arrived, Susan Miller walked into the bank with a different spirit. The same glass doors opened, the same polished floor reflected her heels, but inside, she carried a quiet change. The visit to Michael Johnson's farm had touched her more deeply than she first realized. She remembered the simple wooden furniture, the warmth of his wife Linda's smile, and the way Michael had spoken about patience. His words, complaining doesn't grow crops, kept echoing in her mind. She wanted to carry that lesson into her own work. The staff noticed the difference immediately. Susan no longer rushed straight into her glass office. Instead, she stopped by the front desk, greeting the receptionist with a genuine smile. Good morning, Sarah, she said warmly. How was your weekend? Sarah blinked in surprise. The manager had never asked her that before. It was nice, thank you, she replied, a little nervous. Susan nodded. Good. Let's make this a good week. The small gesture seemed ordinary, but to the staff, it felt unusual. They exchanged glances when Susan walked away, wondering what had caused this sudden change in her tone. Later that morning, an elderly woman entered the bank. She carried a small purse and walked slowly with a cane. In the past, Susan might have asked someone else to attend her, believing her account too small to matter. But now, Susan herself walked over and offered a chair. Good morning, ma'am, she said kindly. How can I help you today? The woman looked up, surprised. Oh. I only came to ask about my savings book. I can never understand these printed numbers. Susan sat beside her patiently, explaining each line, making sure the woman understood. By the end, the woman smiled in relief. Thank you, dear. You explained it so simply. You're always welcome here, Susan said softly. Across the lobby, the younger employees watched with wide eyes. This was not the Susan they knew, the strict manager who cared only about business reports. This was someone different, someone approachable. The days that followed continued in the same way. Susan began walking the lobby more often, speaking with clients, listening to their concerns, even offering water to those who waited. She trained her staff to do the same. Remember, she told them during a morning meeting, every person who walks through those doors has a story. Don't just see numbers. See the human being. We are not just keeping money, we are keeping trust. Some employees nodded, inspired. Others were cautious, wondering if this change would last. But slowly, the atmosphere in the bank began to shift. Clients who once felt invisible now felt noticed. Smiles replaced frowns. The waiting chairs no longer felt like places of neglect but places where people were treated with dignity. One afternoon, a young farmer entered. He wore dusty boots and carried documents in his hand. Nervous, he walked to the counter and asked about a loan. The clerk was about to send him to wait, but Susan saw him from her office. She stepped out immediately. "Sir, come with me," she said kindly. "Let's talk about your needs." The young farmer's shoulders relaxed. He followed her, surprised at her attention. Inside her office, Susan listened carefully, asking questions about his farm, his crops, and his family. She approved the loan quickly, explaining the terms clearly. When he left, his face carried relief, the same kind of relief Susan had seen on Michael's face weeks earlier. She realized then that every act of kindness created ripples, unseen but powerful. Meanwhile, word of Susan's change began to spread. Clients spoke about how differently they were treated, how respected they felt. Even the board members noticed the reports of improved customer satisfaction. One evening, as Susan closed her office, she found herself thinking of Michael again. She wished she could tell him how his patience had transformed not only her but the entire bank. Perhaps she would visit him again soon. That night, Susan sat alone in her apartment, reflecting. She realized her job had once been about climbing higher, about proving herself in numbers and titles. But now, she understood something deeper. True success was not measured in profits but in people. Respect, kindness, and trust were worth more than any account balance. The next morning, she carried that same energy back into the bank. She spoke to her team again. "If someone like Mr. Johnson walks in here, an elderly farmer, a teacher, a worker, anyone, you will treat them as our most important client. Because they are. Never forget that." The staff nodded, and this time, they believed her. What Susan did not know was that her transformation was being noticed beyond the walls of her bank. The board members, especially David and Linda, kept a close eye. They saw improvement in the reports, but more importantly, they heard stories from clients about being treated with dignity. And far away, in his small farmhouse, Michael Johnson carried on with his work, unaware that his quiet patience had begun a wave of change in a bank manager's life. His simple wait of 2 hours had turned into something much greater, a reminder that respect and humility could reshape not only a heart but an entire institution. The weeks rolled into months, and the season of planting turned into the season of harvest. For Michael Johnson, life on the farm was still filled with long days and tired evenings, but there was a sense of relief now. His loan had been renewed, his equipment repaired, and his fields were alive with golden crops swaying under the autumn sky. For Susan Miller, the bank felt different as well. What once seemed like a place of numbers and figures had slowly become a place of human connection. She had rebuilt trust not only with her staff but also with her clients. People smiled when they entered, feeling that they were welcomed, not judged. Susan's new way of leading had spread through the entire branch like sunlight chasing away shadows. Yet in her heart, she often thought of Michael. She had apologized once, but she felt that it was not enough. Something about his patience and quiet dignity continued to guide her every decision. She wanted to see him again, not as a client, but as a teacher who had unknowingly changed her. One crisp Saturday morning, Susan drove once more toward the countryside. The road stretched wide, lined with trees painted in shades of orange and red. She reached the Johnson farm just as the sun was rising, throwing golden light across the fields. Michael was out near the barn, stacking bales of hay. His wife, Linda, waved from the porch when she saw Susan's car pull up. "Miss Miller," Linda called warmly. "What a surprise. Please come in." Susan stepped out, smiling. "Thank you. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Linda said kindly. "Michael, look who's here." Michael straightened his back, wiping sweat from his forehead. When he saw Susan, his eyes softened with recognition. "Well, good morning, Miss Miller. Back to check if your bank money's safe with us farmers." Susan laughed lightly, shaking her head. "No, Mr. Johnson. I came to see you. I owe you more than just an apology. You taught me something that day, and I wanted to thank you again." Michael raised his eyebrows, curious. "What did I teach you?" Susan looked at him seriously. "That patience is strength. That every client deserves respect. Because of you, I've changed how I treat people at the bank. You didn't know it, but your quiet waiting changed everything for me." Michael was silent for a moment. Then he gave a small smile. "I didn't do anything special. I just waited." "You did more than that," Susan replied softly. "You reminded me what respect looks like. You reminded me that success isn't about numbers but about people." Linda brought them tea, and the three of them sat on the porch. The morning air was cool, filled with the smell of hay and fresh earth. Birds chirped in the trees, and the golden fields stretched wide before them. Susan asked about the harvest, and Michael explained proudly how the repaired tractor had made his work easier. He spoke about the younger farmers in the community, some struggling as he once did. That gave Susan an idea. "Mr. Johnson, what if the bank did more for farmers? Not just loans, but real support. Meetings, advice, maybe even small programs to help them manage during hard seasons." Michael looked at her, surprised. "Banks don't usually think that way." "Maybe they should," Susan said firmly. "People like you deserve it. If my board members see the difference it makes, maybe they'll agree." Linda nodded with hope. "That would mean a lot to families around here." Susan left the farm that day with a new purpose. Back at the bank, she drafted a proposal for a community farming support program, a plan to host workshops, offer financial advice, and give better loan terms to farmers who had proven their loyalty. She presented the idea at the next board meeting. At first, some members were skeptical. "Farmers are risky clients," one of them said. But David Williams, the chairman, remembered Michael. He leaned forward. "Risky? These people feed our nation. Without them, there's no bread on our tables. I support this idea." Linda Brown agreed, and soon the proposal was approved. When Susan announced the new program to her staff, there was excitement in the room. "This isn't just about money," she explained. "It's about respect. About seeing people for who they are, not what they have." The program launched quietly, but word spread quickly among farming communities. Farmers who once felt invisible began to see the bank as a partner, not just a lender. And every time Susan saw one of them walk through the doors, she remembered Michael's face, sitting patiently in the lobby that day. One evening, Michael received a letter in the mail. It was from the bank. He opened it at the kitchen table while Linda poured tea. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Johnson, thank you for being the inspiration behind our new community farming support program. Your patience and dignity reminded us of what truly matters. This program is dedicated to you and farmers like you. Sincerely, Susan Miller, Bank Manager." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter. His wife touched his shoulder gently. "See, Michael. Your waiting was not in vain. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." Michael looked out the window at his fields, glowing under the setting sun. For the first time in years, he felt not just relief but pride. He was not just a farmer who borrowed from the bank, he was a reminder of the value of respect, patience, and humanity. And far away in her apartment, Susan looked at her calendar, already planning her next visit to the countryside. Because she knew this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something bigger, something that connected city and farm, banker and farmer, through the simple power of dignity. Months passed since Susan Miller's visit to Michael Johnson's farm, and the changes she had started at the bank had taken root. The community farming support program was thriving. Farmers from nearby towns visited the branch regularly, seeking advice, attending workshops, and learning about financial planning. They no longer saw the bank as a place of intimidation but as a partner in their hard work. Susan herself felt a transformation she had never expected. Every morning, she walked into the lobby with a sense of purpose, greeting every client personally. She remembered Michael's patience and quiet dignity every time she spoke to someone who needed extra attention. The lessons he had taught her were now part of her daily work. One bright morning, Susan received a phone call from the chairman of the board, David Williams. "Good morning, Susan," he said warmly. "I wanted to let you know that the program is being recognized at the national level. Your branch is being used as an example of excellent customer service and community engagement." Susan smiled, feeling a sense of pride. "Thank you, sir. None of this would have been possible without the inspiration from Michael Johnson." David chuckled. Sometimes the simplest acts like patience and dignity can create the biggest change. Never forget that. Meanwhile, at the Johnson farm, Michael and his wife, Linda, watched their crops grow under the autumn sun. The barn repairs were complete, the tractor ran smoothly, and the farm was thriving. Michael received letters from other farmers who had benefited from the new bank program. Some shared their struggles, others thanked him indirectly for the way his patience had inspired change at the bank. One afternoon, Susan drove to the farm once again, this time bringing with her a small gathering of bank staff. She wanted them to see the people behind the numbers they handled every day. Michael and Linda welcomed them warmly. "You've come a long way," Michael said quietly, as he showed them the fields and the new barn. Susan looked around and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "No, Michael," she said softly. "You've taken us a long way. Your patience, your quiet strength, it reminded me what really matters. You are the reason this program exists." The staff members were amazed. They watched Michael work with pride and humility, learning firsthand the effort it took to run a farm. They realized that the clients they once considered small or insignificant were actually the backbone of the community. After the tour, they sat together on the porch. Susan handed Michael a small plaque from the bank, engraved with the words, "In honor of Michael Johnson, whose patience and dignity inspired change and reminded us all of the power of respect." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he held the plaque. Linda's eyes glistened with tears. "You didn't just help your farm," Susan said, her voice filled with emotion. "You helped an entire community. You helped us all remember what truly matters." Michael smiled humbly. "I just waited," he said simply. "I didn't ask for recognition. I did what I had to do just like anyone else." Susan shook her head, smiling. "Sometimes the simplest acts create the greatest impact. You've shown all of us that." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the fields, Susan looked at the horizon and felt hope. She realized that the journey she had begun that day in the bank lobby when she had ignored Michael and made him wait had become something far greater than she had imagined. Not only had she changed, but so had her staff, the bank, and the lives of countless farmers. A simple act of patience, a quiet strength, and the dignity of one elderly man had sparked a ripple of kindness and respect that could not be undone. Michael watched the group leave, feeling a quiet satisfaction in his heart. He returned to his work, stacking hay and checking the crops, knowing that his farm and his story had made a difference far beyond the fences of his land. That evening, he and Linda sat together on the porch, sipping tea. "Your patience has changed more than our farm, Michael," Linda said softly. He smiled, looking at the horizon where the fields met the sky. "Sometimes, it just takes waiting. And believing that people can see you, if only they take the time." Far away, Susan drove back to the city that evening, her heart full. She knew that she would never treat a client the same way again. And she knew that the lesson Michael had taught her about patience, respect, and dignity would stay with her for the rest of her life. The bank continued to grow, the community continued to flourish, and Michael's quiet strength remained a reminder that even the smallest acts of patience could create extraordinary change. And so, the story that began with 2 hours of waiting ended not just with a renewed loan, but with hearts transformed, lessons learned, and a legacy of respect that would be remembered for years to come.